In a hangar filled with tension, surrounded by engineers with polished degrees and cutting-edge tools, an old man with a limp and a battered toolbox stepped forward. The younger men exchanged glances, their voices low but sharp. Is he serious? This isn't some rusty tractor. What's he gonna do? Fix it with that old wrench? He didn't argue. He didn't boast. Instead, Edward Mercer knelt beside the Army's most advanced tank and heard what no one else could. It's not the engine, he said softly. It's the heartbeat of the machine itself. The room went silent. Judgments froze, because in that moment, they realized they'd underestimated the only man who could save them. Stay with us. Discover the untold story of the forgotten genius who taught a lesson in humility. Edward Ed Mercer was born into silence. His earliest memory was not of a mother's voice or a father's laugh, but the steady ticking of a broken clock on the orphanage wall, a clock that no one ever bothered to fix. Maybe that was the first machine that called to him, though he didn't know it then. Ed's parents had perished in a house fire when he was barely 3. With no living relatives willing to take him, he became a ward of the state, shuffled between foster homes like a forgotten package. Most families took him in out of duty or for the small stipend. Few offered real warmth. But when Ed was 9, everything changed for a while when he was placed with the Carters. The Carters lived on the edge of a dusty farming town in New Mexico. Tom Carter was a no-nonsense man with a handshake like a vice, and hands hardened from years of tilling the stubborn land. His wife Ellen was kind in that quiet way, slipping an extra biscuit on Ed's plate, knitting him a scarf without asking his favorite color. Their farm wasn't much: an aging red barn, 2 stubborn mules, and machinery that coughed more than it ran. But to Ed, it felt like a kingdom. It was on that farm that Ed discovered what would become his life's calling. One sweltering summer afternoon, Tom fought with the rusted tractor, its engine sputtering, refusing to plow the field. Ed watched him, noticing the faintest of rhythms in the engine's failure. That night after supper, while the adults rested, Ed crept into the barn with a battered manual he'd found. By dawn, his small hands blackened with grease. The machine roared to life. Tom awoke to the sound, came running, and stared in disbelief at the boy beside the humming tractor. He said nothing, just clapped Ed on the shoulder, a gesture that meant more than any words. Word spread. Farmers began to call on Ed when their hay balers jammed or their generators quit. He never charged a dime. For him, the reward was in the work, in listening, diagnosing, making whole what was broken. By age 10, Ed wasn't just the orphan boy on the Carter farm. He was that kid who could fix anything. For nearly 2 years, Ed lived with the Carters, calling their modest house home, believing maybe, just maybe, he'd found where he belonged. Tom and Ellen spoke often of adopting him, but life has a cruel way of shifting course. When Ellen fell ill, medical bills mounted. The adoption papers were never filed. A distant aunt surfaced, offering Ed a room in a city apartment far from the fields he loved. The Carters, hearts heavy, let him go, promising they'd write. And they did, for a while. Then the letters stopped. That near adoption taught Ed a harsh truth. Belonging could be fleeting. It instilled in him an independent streak, a belief that he couldn't rely on promises or paperwork. If he wanted a place in the world, he'd have to build it with his own hands. At 17, with nothing tying him down, Ed enlisted in the Army. Some said he was running from his past, but Ed knew better. The Army wasn't just an escape. It was the promise of structure, of family, of machines that demanded attention and rewarded care. It was a place where he could put his gift to use, where the hum of engines and the rhythm of gears would become his language of service. And in that choice, Ed Mercer wasn't just fixing broken machines anymore. He was beginning to mend the quiet fractures in his own soul. Ed Mercer's life after the Army wasn't marked by parades, medals, or grateful handshakes. Instead, it was marked by pain, constant, grinding pain that started in his leg and sometimes seemed to reach all the way to his heart. The injury came during a test of an experimental engine, a failure of materials, a burst of metal where no burst should have been. Shrapnel tore through his right leg, They patched him up as best they could, but no surgery could make him whole again. The fragments left behind became part of him, reminders with every step that the system that once praised him had moved on without him. At first, Ed tried to fight the bitterness. He told himself it was just life. Things break, people move on. He focused on the small victories, getting up each morning despite the throbbing ache that flared before his feet hit the floor. He walked with a limp, sure, but he walked. That counted for something. His military pension barely covered his rent in a small, drafty apartment on the edge of Tucson. The medical bills came steady as rain. Physical therapy, pain medications, doctor visits. They drained what little savings he'd managed to keep. Ed sold the house he and his wife had once shared, a house that echoed with the silence she left behind when she walked out 2 years after the accident. She said she couldn't watch him fade like that, couldn't stand the look in his eyes. He couldn't blame her. So Ed did what he always had. He worked. He took whatever jobs he could, fixing tractors on ranches, welding broken fence posts, tuning up old pickups for folks who couldn't afford a mechanic's shop. He never advertised. People just knew. If something was broken and no one else could fix it, Ed Mercer was your man. There was the time a school bus broke down on the first day of the semester, stranding 20 kids on the side of a rural road. Ed happened to drive by in his creaky old truck. He pulled over, asked no questions, and crawled under the bus right there in the dirt. With nothing but a wrench and some wire, he got that engine humming again. When the school tried to pay him, he shook his head. "Just keep those kids safe," he said. Or the night a monsoon storm knocked out power across his neighborhood. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Torres, relied on an oxygen machine. Ed worked by flashlight in the pouring rain, rebuilding an ancient generator that hadn't run in years. The machine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, and with it, so did her breathing. But for all these quiet acts of service, Ed felt invisible to the world that once saluted him, the military he'd given his youth to, the government he'd trusted to stand by him. They sent form letters, denied claims, lost paperwork. He wasn't angry. Anger took too much energy. He was tired. Tired of fighting for what should have come without question. Tired of being seen as a broken tool rather than the man who'd once built engines no one else could understand. Still, he carried on. Each morning, he'd sit on the edge of his bed, massage the stiff muscles in his leg, sip bitter coffee from the same dented thermos, and step out into the world with his limp toolbox in hand. Because Ed Mercer knew one truth that kept him going. As long as something was broken somewhere, he still had a purpose. It was a Monday morning like any other. The Arizona sun had just begun to creep over the desert, painting the world in burnt oranges and dusty golds. Ed Mercer stood by a battered John Deere tractor, adjusting a stubborn hydraulic cylinder. His fingers, though aged and scarred, still moved with a precision born of decades of listening to machines. The air smelled of grease, metal, and mesquite. Then came the sound that didn't belong, the ring of his old flip phone, muffled beneath a rag on the workbench. Ed wiped his hands on his jeans, half expecting it to be a wrong number or a neighbor needing help. "Mercer," he answered, his voice as steady as ever. "Mr. Mercer, this is General Raymond Cole from Fort Jackson. We need your help. It's urgent." Ed nearly laughed. "I think you've got the wrong guy, General." "No mistake. You're Edward Mercer, former sergeant, Army Corps of Engineers." Ed froze, heart skipping a beat at hearing his old rank spoken aloud, a title he hadn't worn in decades. The voice on the other end wasn't just official. It carried that edge he remembered from his service days, the tone that meant something had gone terribly wrong. There was a pause. Ed glanced at the tractor, its green paint faded and chipped, the machine stubborn but familiar. He thought of hanging up, but something in General Cole's voice tugged at a part of him he tried to bury, the part that still cared. "I'll come," Ed said quietly. The drive to Fort Jackson was long and lonely. Ed's old pickup creaked over desert roads, the tires kicking up small clouds of red dust. His toolbox rattled beside him, and the thermos of black coffee sat untouched. The horizon shimmered in the heat, and with every mile, memories surfaced like ghosts. He remembered the first time he'd driven onto a military base as a wide-eyed 17-year-old, full of hope and hunger to belong. The smell of diesel and the sound of drill sergeants barking orders had made him feel like he'd finally found a place where things made sense. He remembered late nights in the motor pool, rebuilding engines under bare bulbs, the air thick with sweat and oil, the camaraderie, the laughter, the shared exhaustion after a job well done. Those were the moments he missed most. And then, the memory he tried not to revisit, the day of the explosion, the sound of metal tearing, the searing pain in his leg, the look on his commander's face when they realized the cost of that failure. The day his military life ended and his exile began. As the gates of Fort Jackson came into view, Ed felt his pulse quicken. The base looked both familiar and foreign, like visiting a childhood home repainted and remodeled by strangers. He saw the American flag snapping in the wind, the guard towers, the soldiers moving with purpose. At the gate, a young private eyed him warily, taking in his worn-out boots, his limp, his battered truck. Ed gave his name, and after a tense exchange of phone calls, was waved through. Driving onto the base, Ed felt the weight of the years pressing down. The rows of barracks, the smell of jet fuel in the air, the distant rumble of machinery, all of it pulled him back in time. But this wasn't his world anymore. And yet, here he was, summoned by a call he never expected, returning to a place that had once been home. Somewhere deep down, Ed wondered, was this a second chance or just another reminder of what he'd lost? The hangar doors loomed like a gateway to another life. As Ed Mercer stepped inside, the air shifted, cooler, heavy with the mingled scents of machine oil, fresh paint, and the faint bite of ozone from electrical testing. The cavernous space echoed with the clatter of tools, the low hum of generators, and the clipped voices of men who clearly believed they were the smartest in the room. At the far end, beneath a web of scaffolding and cables, stood the Army's prized machine. The tank Ed had heard whispers about but never thought he'd see. Sleek angles, matte armor, and at its heart, an engine that was supposed to be the future. And yet here it sat, silent, broken, an expensive promise unfulfilled. Beside it clustered 3 engineers in white lab coats, each one polished as their degrees suggested. The leader, Dr. Samuel Brooks, glanced up at Ed's approach, his expression flickering somewhere between surprise and disapproval. "This is the specialist?" Brooks asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. His voice carried in the hangar's emptiness, amplified by the steel walls. Sergeant Williams, who'd led Ed in, gave a short nod. "Yes, sir. Edward Mercer." Brooks didn't offer a handshake. "We expected someone more current. The system we're working with is extremely advanced. Hybrid tech, proprietary algorithms, cutting-edge integration." Ed let the words wash over him. He'd heard this tone before, the polite dismissal wrapped in technical jargon, the kind that said, "We've already decided you're not worth our time." But Ed didn't argue, didn't boast. He simply set down his toolbox, battered, scarred, older than some of the men in the room, and looked at the machine. The hangar seemed to fall away. The engineer's chatter blurred into background noise. Ed breathed in deeply, grounding himself in what he knew. The faint tang of hot metal, the undertone of grease, the subtle, almost sweet scent of hydraulic fluid, barely noticeable but there. He approached the tank with reverence, like a priest nearing an altar. His fingers brushed its side, feeling not just the metal but the story it told. Stress points where the panels join. The faintest vibration, still lingering after the last failed test run. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked quietly. Brooks gave a tight shrug. "We've had specialists on it all week, but be my guest." Ed opened his toolbox. Not a laptop in sight. No digital scanners. Just well-worn hand tools, a flashlight, and a mechanical stethoscope. The kind that would have looked at home in a 1950s garage. The younger engineer, a thin man with glasses, were smirked. "You do realize this isn't a tractor, right?" Ed said nothing. He knelt beside the engine bay, placed the stethoscope against key points, and closed his eyes. The hangar's noises faded. All he heard was the machine, its rhythms, its disruptions. He traced the path of power with his mind, feeling where it should flow, where it stuttered. His movements were slow, deliberate, not mechanical but meditative. For nearly 20 minutes, Ed worked in silence. the engineers growing increasingly restless. Finally, he stood, dusted his hands on his jeans, and spoke. It's not the engine, it's the mount. There's a micro vibration that only shows up when it heats and expands, throws off the sync between systems. Brooks blinked. We checked the mount. Cold, Ed said simply. Check it hot. And with that, he picked up his tools, turned, and began to walk away, leaving behind a room that no longer seemed quite so sure of itself. Night had fallen by the time Ed Mercer made it back to his small workshop behind the old service station he called home. The desert air was cool, the kind of quiet only broken by the distant bark of a coyote or the hum of power lines. Inside, the single bulb above his workbench flickered as he scrubbed the grease from his hands, the scent of soap and oil mingling in the air. He had no expectations. He'd done what he could, offered what he knew. The rest wasn't his to carry. The phone rang just as he set his mug of coffee down. Ed stared at it for a long second, the old flip phone's glow a small beacon in the dim room. Mercer, he answered, voice steady as stone. Mr. Mercer, this is Dr. Brooks. The voice on the other end was different now, stripped of its earlier edge, quieter somehow. I owe you an apology, Brooks continued. You were right. We ran the tests as you suggested. Hot. The micro vibration was exactly as you said. The dampers failed after prolonged heat exposure. You saved the project. Ed let the words hang between them, unmoved by the sudden shift from dismissal to respect. He'd seen this pattern before. The doubting, the pride, the reluctant admission once facts made denial impossible. I didn't do it for thanks, Doctor, he said softly. Brooks hesitated, then replied. The general would like to speak with you. Would you come back? Ed agreed, though not for praise or reward. Something in Brooks's voice, something genuine this time, made him think maybe this wasn't just about the machine anymore. The next morning, Ed pulled into the Fort Jackson lot, his old truck as out of place among the sleek military SUVs as he had been in that hangar. But this time, when he walked in, there were no smirks, no folded arms or glances traded behind his back. There was only respect, unspoken, but thick in the air. Brooks was waiting with General Cole near the tank. The machine stood whole now, quiet and still, but no longer broken. The general stepped forward, extending a hand. Sergeant Mercer, he said, deliberately using Ed's rank, I owe you an apology for how you were received. There's no need, sir. Yes, there is, Cole insisted. You identified a failure no one else could see. You didn't just save this tank. You reminded us what experience looks like, and how easily we forget its value. Ed glanced at the engineers behind them, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and admiration. Brooks stepped forward. Mr. Mercer, I spoke out of turn the other day. I judged what I saw, not what was standing in front of me. I'm sorry. Ed nodded, his voice low but clear. Doctor, it's all right. It happens more than you'd think. As they spoke, Ed's mind wandered, not out of disrespect, but reflection. Why is wisdom so hard for people to see unless it wears a suit, he wondered. Why do hands that are calloused and tools that are old make folks think the mind behind them must be outdated too? The general made an offer then, a position, a chance to consult on future projects, a return to the system that had once turned its back on him. Ed smiled, slow and kind. I appreciate it, sir, truly, but I belong out there now, where things are broken, and a man can fix them with his own two hands. And as he left the hangar, toolbox in hand, Ed felt no bitterness, only quiet satisfaction, not for proving anyone wrong, but for proving to himself that he still mattered. General Cole's hand lingered on Ed Mercer's shoulder as they stood together beneath the cavernous steel rafters of the hangar. The tank, now whole and silent, glinted in the morning light streaming through the high windows. Sergeant Mercer, the general began, his voice softened by genuine respect. I don't want this to end here. We could use a man like you. No, we need a man like you. We've got other projects in trouble. I want you on board. Consultant, senior advisor, whatever title you want. Ed looked at the man, saw the sincerity in his eyes. He glanced past him to Dr. Brooks, to the younger engineers, who had once doubted him, but now watched him with a kind of humbled admiration. But Ed's gaze didn't linger on their faces. His eyes wandered to the tank, to his old toolbox sitting on the concrete floor, to the open hangar doors beyond. Out there, the desert waited, wide, empty, honest. He took a slow breath, tasting the familiar tang of machine oil in the air, and answered the only way he knew how. "General, I appreciate that. I really do. But I'm not meant for boardrooms or titles. I serve by fixing what's broken, not by titles." The general opened his mouth to reply, but Ed held up a hand, gentle but firm. "I spent too long thinking a title made me valuable," Ed continued, his voice steady. "Sergeant, engineer, mechanic. I thought if I worked hard enough, the name on my uniform would mean something that no one could take away. But the truth is, titles come and go. What matters is the work and the good it does. That's all." Brooks stepped forward. "But don't you want to be part of something bigger again? Don't you want a seat at the table?" Ed smiled, slow and knowing. "Son, I've already got a seat. It just doesn't look like the ones you're used to." He could see the confusion in Brooks's face, the way the younger man struggled to understand. And Ed didn't blame him. It had taken Ed decades to learn that lesson himself. Inside, Ed's thoughts turned over quietly. "They think they're offering me honor, a way back in. But I never left what mattered. I never stopped serving. Every fence mended, every old engine brought back to life, every neighbor I helped during a storm. That was my service. No uniform needed. I don't need a badge or an office or a paycheck with fancy stamps. I need a problem to solve, a thing to fix. That's where I belong." The general nodded at last, seeing that Ed's mind was set. "Then let me do this," he said, pulling a crisp envelope from his coat. "This is for what you did, and for what you should have been given a long time ago." Ed hesitated. The envelope felt heavy in the air between them. Heavy with meaning, with recognition, long overdue. "I didn't do it for that, sir," he said softly. "I know," Cole replied. "That's why you deserve it." Ed accepted it without looking inside. Not because he didn't care, but because the real reward wasn't on paper. It was in the stillness of the tank, the shift in the room, the quiet respect in the eyes of those who had finally seen him as he was. And as Ed picked up his toolbox and walked toward the open doors, the morning sun painted the floor in gold. He stepped into the light, no title on his back. Just a man going where he was needed. The desert morning was quiet, save for the steady sound of a wrench turning. Ed Mercer crouched beside an old generator outside his workshop, the worn structure casting long shadows across the sun-baked earth. The air smelled of dust and gasoline, of work that was honest and necessary. He heard the vehicle before he saw it. The soft crunch of tires on the dirt road. The low hum of a government-issued SUV. Ed didn't look up at first. He finished tightening the bolt, wiped his hands on a rag, and only then turned to greet his visitor. Dr. Samuel Brooks stepped out of the SUV, his white lab coat traded for a simple button-down shirt. He looked out of place under the wide Arizona sky. A man used to steel and glass, not sun and sand. He shaded his eyes as he approached. "Morning, Mr. Mercer," Brooks said, his voice quieter than Ed remembered. "Morning, Doctor," Ed replied, setting his tools down and straightening, his legs stiff but steady. "What brings you all the way out here?" Brooks hesitated. He glanced at the generator, at the small, weathered workshop, at the battered truck parked nearby. "I had to see you," he said, "in person." Ed raised an eyebrow, waiting. Brooks took a deep breath. "You taught me something, back at the hangar, and I didn't say it right at the time. I didn't even realize it then, but I see it now." Ed folded his arms, watching the younger man with that steady gaze that made people feel both seen and measured. "I've spent my career in labs, in meetings, surrounded by people with fancy degrees. We chase data, models, simulations, and sometimes we miss what's right in front of us." Brooks paused, searching for the right words. "When you put that stethoscope to the engine, you heard what none of us could. I thought I was better because of what was on my wall. But you listened. And that made all the difference." Ed looked out toward the horizon, where the desert met the sky in a shimmering line. His voice was soft when he spoke. "Machines, like people, always give you a warning," he said. "If you listen, a rattle before a break, a hitch in the rhythm, a change in the sound. But folks don't always hear it. Too busy, too proud, too sure they already know the answers. Brooks lowered his head, humbled by the truth of it. I wanted to thank you, Mr. Mercer. Not just for fixing that tank, but for opening my eyes. I've been thinking about it ever since. About listening better. To machines, to people. Ed smiled. A small, quiet smile that reached his eyes. That's good, son. That's real good. There was a long pause, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then Brooks extended his hand. No fanfare, no speech. Just a gesture of respect, one craftsman to another, regardless of titles or degrees. Ed took it, his grip firm but gentle. And in that handshake, no words were needed. The past, the doubt, the dismissal, fell away. What remained was respect, hard-earned and honest. Brooks turned at last to leave, walking back to the SUV, the morning sun casting golden light across the dirt. Ed watched him go, then turned back to his generator. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and Ed Mercer was exactly where he belonged. Ed Mercer's story isn't just about a man fixing a machine. It's about what we value, or fail to value, in our modern world. In today's fast-paced, technology-driven society, it's easy to overlook those who don't boast the newest title, the latest degree, or the flashiest resume. But men and women like Ed, the quiet doers, the ones who listen before they act, who work not for praise but because it's the right thing to do, remind us of something essential, that wisdom often lives in the places we forget to look. In small towns across America, in neighborhoods just like yours, there are people like Ed who keep our communities running. The veteran who knows how to fix the church boiler before winter hits. The retired electrician who rewires a neighbor's house after a storm. The old mechanic who keeps the town's school buses rolling safely down the road. Their work doesn't make headlines, but without them, our world wouldn't function half as well as it does. And isn't that a lesson for all of us? Ed's story challenges us to pause and ask, do we truly see and appreciate those around us who quietly fix what's broken? Are we listening to the voices of experience? The ones who've lived through challenges and still stand ready to help? In today's world, where we're quick to debate online, to chase new trends, maybe it's time we also slow down, to hear the soft rattle before the break, to notice the person who steps in without fanfare, toolbox in hand. We want to hear from you. Do you know someone like Ed? Someone who fixes what's broken in machines, in communities, and lives, without asking for anything in return? What lesson from Ed's story do you think applies most to our modern life? Share their story or your thoughts in the comments below. Let's celebrate these quiet heroes together. And here's something to ponder. Something we hope sparks conversation. If Ed had accepted that offer to rejoin the system, would he have lost part of what made him who he is? Do we, as a society, sometimes force people to choose between their calling and their comfort? We'd love to hear your views. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched you, if it made you think, reflect, or remember someone important, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that honor the quiet strength, wisdom, and heart of everyday heroes, especially those from generations who paved the way for us all. Remember, the world doesn't just need loud voices and grand gestures. Sometimes it needs someone who knows how to listen to a machine, to a neighbor, to what's truly broken, and quietly make it right.